Welcome to Omens and Elixirs, a podcast where we explore philosophy, alchemy, mythology, symbolism, and all the forgotten ways of seeing the world. I am Marissa, and wherever you are, I invite you to slow down, grab some tea, and today we're going to step into the alchemical garden. The more I study alchemy, the less I think it has anything to do with turning lead into gold. Or maybe I should say, the more I realize that's only one very surface level of the story, because underneath the furnaces and the strange symbols and the impossible recipes is something so much deeper, something that honestly I think has the potential to completely change the way you see yourself. And that is exactly what happened to me when I began reading the Rosarium Philosophorum, which is the Rosary of the Philosophers. But before we actually get into this medieval manuscript, I think it's important that we first talk about alchemy itself, because I think a lot of people hear the word alchemy and they immediately picture an old man standing in a laboratory surrounded by glass flasks and strange metals, trying to figure out how to create an immortal elixir or turn lead into gold. And I guess, yes, it's part of it. Alchemists did have laboratories. They conducted experiments and worked with metals, minerals, salts, plants, medicine, and all kinds of chemical processes. In fact, many of the techniques they developed would eventually contribute to what we now know as chemistry. But where I think a lot of people misunderstand alchemy is alchemy has so many layers to it. The physical work was only one layer of something much, much deeper. The alchemist wasn't just trying to turn lead into gold. They were trying to understand something on a much deeper level. They wanted to understand nature, to understand the relationship between spirit and matter. They wanted to understand creation itself, God, the human psyche, transformation. The laboratory wasn't just a place where they experimented on metals. They also experimented on themselves, and I think once you begin looking at alchemy through that lens, everything starts to make a lot more sense. Kind of reading medieval alchemy manuscripts has been so frustrating. I'm sure if you have read these really old ancient medieval alchemy texts, they're extremely cryptic, extremely dense. There's so much information packed in one sentence. I don't even know how they do it. But yeah, they are just incredibly cryptic, and they're definitely the most frustrating text I've ever read. And reading them feels like you're literally trying to decipher an ancient code in an ancient language you have no idea even existed or what it even is. Because every word has layers to it. One word can mean 3 different things depending on the sentence and the context of that sentence. The same exact symbol can refer to a literal substance in one paragraph, and then a psychological or spiritual principle in the next. It is quite intense. I think it really makes you question everything that they are saying. And we're gonna go a bit deeper into the meanings and the symbolisms of alchemy. Because gold isn't always talking about gold, and death isn't always talking about literal death. The more you read, the more you realize that almost nothing is ever meant literally. And that was definitely not by accident. The alchemists were an incredibly secretive group. Part of that was because depending on where they lived or when they lived, there was always a possibility of being accused of fraud or hearsay. The churches wanted to kill them. But it also went much deeper than that. They generally believed this knowledge was sacred. They believed that if this knowledge fell into the wrong hands or into the hands of someone who wasn't prepared for it, it could be misunderstood, abused, or completely distorted. So they were gatekeepers. And I don't think they were like gatekeeping out of ego, but it was really more about responsibility. They believed these mysteries revealed themselves only to people who were willing to do the work, not people who are just like reading text. And I think it's just similar to philosophy in general. I think to be a really great philosopher, it's not just about contemplating and then maybe writing a book or explaining it, it's living it. It is applying that knowledge into the real world, into your work. So really, these mysteries revealed themselves to people who were willing to observe nature, to question themselves, spend years and years studying, and ultimately, people whom God permitted to understand. A lot of ancient alchemists really believed that these like secrets of the universe, secrets of alchemy, were only revealed to people that God allowed this knowledge to be understood. The idea comes up like over and over again in alchemical literature. You even see it throughout the Rosarium Philosophorum. Now, I want to preface that like this text is probably the least cryptic text of any alchemical medieval manuscript. I could be wrong, but just from my own knowledge, this author was like the most revealing of the alchemical secrets. But even he kept repeating things like only the initiated alchemists would understand this, or that these mysteries were not meant for every man. He's almost reminding you as you're like reading this that if you're looking for a straightforward instruction manual, you're already missing the point. The alchemists didn't really care if everyone understood them. They were not trying to like convince the masses. They weren't trying to preach or sharing their discoveries or findings. They were writing for the true seekers of the arts, for the people willing to wrestle with the symbols rather than demand immediate answers. And honestly, it's really refreshing because today in our world, everything is so instantly understandable. We want a 5-minute explanation, a quick summary. Alchemy just refuses to give you that completely, which is definitely frustrating, but it really wants you to like sit with the mystery, to contemplate, to really use your brain. This is really a text, like any alchemical medieval manuscript, is a text you come back to over and over again, reading the same page over and over again until one day something just clicks, like you just missed something, and now finally with all the other knowledge you've gained, you see things that weren't there before, if that makes sense. I've read this text many times over the years, and it's taking me years to really understand what I'm reading or kind of coming to my own conclusions. I mean, I'm not claiming that I know exactly what this author is trying to say. I have my own conclusions. I really think that's the point. What is your conclusion? After this series, I would love to know your conclusions and what you think this text is actually saying. I really think that is where real learning happens, when you can just come up with your own conclusions of things and not really just take these texts as face values, or any text as face values. Drawing your own conclusions is where real learning happens. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Another thing I want to talk about is it's really important to understand about alchemy is that I personally don't think it's primarily about chemistry. Now, before any chemists come for me, there are absolutely chemical operations in alchemy. There are definitely real experiments, real substances, but I don't think that's the ultimate purpose of this art. If you read these texts literally, they almost sound ridiculous, and I know a lot of alchemists, chemists, modern chemists and medieval chemists have both criticized alchemy as being a scam or saying those guys have no idea what they're doing, it doesn't work, etc., etc. I think they're reading the text through the wrong lens because alchemy is a spiritual art. It is a philosophical art. The chemistry is there, but it is serving something so much bigger. The physical transformations are mirrors of inner transformations. And to understand why the alchemists thought that way, you have to understand who their greatest teacher was, which was nature. Again and again, the alchemical authors tell us that if you don't understand the principles of nature, you will never understand alchemy. It wasn't because nature was simply somewhere they gathered their ingredients, but nature was really demonstrating the entire process. They watched seeds disappear into the darkness of the earth before emerging into new life. They watched decay become nourishment. If you think about the caterpillar, it completely dissolves and becomes something unrecognizable before emerging as a butterfly. Nature was constantly showing them that death wasn't the end. Transformation was built into creation itself. So alchemists are not trying to work outside of nature. They aren't trying to conquer nature. They believed nature already knew exactly what she was doing. Their job was to simply observe her carefully enough to understand her processes, and in some cases to help those natural processes along without violating them. Another idea you'll see throughout alchemical philosophy is that something in existence has both a material and a spiritual aspect. Matter and spirit, body and soul, the visible and the invisible. You can't really fully understand one without the other, which brings us to two of the most important symbols in all of alchemy, the sun and the moon. The sun often represents consciousness, reason, spirit, illumination, and it is the active principle. It's associated with gold because gold symbolizes something that is perfected and incorruptible. And the moon represents intuition, imagination, the unconscious, reflection, symbols, the soul, and it is the receptive principle. It's associated with silver because it reflects light rather than produces it. The sun is masculine and the moon is feminine. The goal of alchemy isn't to choose the sun over the moon or vice versa, or saying one is better than the other. It's really the goal in their union, their marriage, because only when consciousness and the unconscious, the spirit and matter begin working together does something whole emerge. There is a quote that is often attributed to Buddha that says, 3 things cannot long remain hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. Whether he actually said it or not, I think it perfectly captures something the alchemists understood. Truth has a way of revealing itself. I'm sure we are all very, very familiar with that sentiment. The more honestly you observe nature, the more honestly you observe yourself. The harder it becomes to keep living under illusion. And maybe that's what alchemy has always been about. Not really like escaping reality or trying to literally make gold. It's more about becoming the kind of person who can perceive truth, which is why I don't think alchemy is just relevant if you're interested in history or medieval manuscripts. I think it's really relevant to every single one of us because every one of us is already in the middle of our own alchemical process. Every loss, every relationship, every season where who you used to be no longer fits you that is really the great work. Your life is the laboratory. And I think if you begin approaching your life the way the alchemists approach nature, with curiosity, humility, and patience, and really the willingness to let transformation happen instead of forcing it, you'll find that alchemy isn't just something you study, it is really a way of living. And I think that's the perfect place to begin our journey into the Rosarium Philosophorum. Sorry, that was a really long introductory, but I felt like I had to get that out of the way so you can understand the context and the mindset of the more traditional alchemist. So, a little side note, I just want to say that the alchemists were really trying to find this hidden truth of nature. And throughout this series, we are going to deep dive into how you go about finding this hidden truth of nature. Alright, now that we got all of that out of the way and talked a little bit about alchemy itself, I want to finally actually get into the contents of the Rosarium Philosophorum. And I do want to preface that I'm not really going to go into the minute details in everything that the author is discussing, nor the actual chemical reactions of these things. I want to talk more about how this can actually help you in your own journey of self-transformation, and more into the psychological and symbolism of alchemy in our inner worlds, if that makes sense. I could go down every single rabbit hole of what this author is saying and what all these things could mean, but I'm kind of going to do a more generalized perspective of what he is talking about. Okay, so we're going to look at the first section today because honestly there is so much packed into just these first few pages that I think it just deserves its own episode. One of the very first things that the author says is this: all men who work beyond nature are deceivers and work in an unlawful manner. When I first read that, I stopped because I think that one sentence tells you almost everything you need to know about how an alchemist viewed the world, as we just kind of went over in the introduction of this podcast. Because throughout all alchemical literature, nature is described as the truest teacher. It's not another alchemist or a specific text or book, it is nature itself. And the author makes it very, very clear that if you don't understand the principles of nature, you're never going to understand the great work. And this idea comes up constantly throughout this text and other alchemical literature too. Alchemy is not about forcing nature to do something she wouldn't normally do. It's about understanding her so deeply that you actually start to cooperate with her. You are assisting nature in finishing what she has already begun. You are not violating nature, you are learning from her, and there is a huge distinction. And I think that's such a radically different mindset from the one we often have today. Because today we want to force things, we want to control outcomes, we want things to speed up. The alchemist would literally tell you to just go watch a tree, watch a flower unfold, or just simply watch and observe the changing of the seasons, because nature already knows how transformation works. Something else the author repeats throughout this opening is that the entire art is fundamentally based on one thing. Not, 10 things or 100 secret ingredients. It is one thing. What is interesting is that alchemical authors almost never call it by one name. They call it mercury, then water, they call it the stone, the philosopher's stone, the earth. They call it countless other names, which makes reading these texts honestly really exhausting and confusing. But I really don't think they're trying to confuse us for no reason. They're really trying to show us that one reality can appear under many different names. The author also says something that I found really fascinating, which is that the agent and the patient must come from the same source while appearing different. For a bit more context, the agent and the patient represent the universal active and passive principles required for any transformation. For example, male and female, fire and water. The agent is the active principle, which is the masculine principle represented by the sun, sulfur, fire. The patient is the passive principle, which is the feminine. It's associated with Mercury, with the moon, with water and moisture. So in other words, true creation doesn't happen because two completely unrelated things collide. It happens because complementary opposites recognize that they already belong to the same whole. And that's really a pattern you start seeing everywhere in our world, in our day-to-day life. Day and night, the sun and moon, masculine and feminine, matter and form. One receives and the other one shapes. Nothing can create alone. Aristotle actually talks about something similar when he describes matter and form. Matter is pure potential, while form gives that potential its identity. A block of marble has the potential to become countless things, but it isn't until it receives form that it becomes a statue. Alchemy seems to take that same idea and apply it to all of nature. Everything develops through the union of complementary principles, and when those principles unite in the proper way, something more perfect and complete emerges. The author then says something that's completely caught me off guard. He describes the Philosopher's Stone as being composed of the four classical elements. He says it's found everywhere, it's possessed by both the rich and the poor, it's composed of body, soul, and spirit, and through transformation, it reaches perfection. And I love that because if that's true, then the stone isn't something hidden at the top of a mountain. It's already woven into ordinary existence. The extraordinary is hidden inside the ordinary. The alchemists also believed that metals themselves had different developmental stages. Gold wasn't viewed as a completely different substance from lead. Rather, all metals were understood as different stages of one developmental process, with gold representing the most complete expression of that process. In other words, nature was already trying to make gold. The alchemists simply believed they could assist nature in completing what she had already begun. And again, it wasn't trying to force, it was really about assisting nature. One alchemist, Arnold of Villanova, said that the art requires four things: an understanding of nature, patience, disciplined reasoning, and symbolic thinking. I love that list because you'll notice what's missing. He doesn't say you need to be wealthy or need a university degree. He doesn't even say you need to be exceptionally intelligent. You just need to be patient and observe and think symbolically. You need to understand nature. That's it. Now, some alchemical texts do say that poor men are excluded from the arts. Even Aristotle famously suggested that it was difficult for a poor man to become a philosopher, and many historians think that's because philosophy and alchemy required enormous amounts of leisure time and resources. And yeah, that's probably part of it. If you're spending every waking hour trying to survive, you don't have much time left to contemplate the nature of reality. Which reminds me a little bit of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When you're stuck in survival mode, your mind isn't naturally drawn toward philosophy. It's drawn toward making it through another day. But personally, I don't think poverty itself excludes someone from alchemy. I do think greed does. If your only reason for approaching alchemy is wealth, power, status, or taking shortcuts, you've definitely misunderstood alchemy as a whole, and you're not going to get what you want. The author also warns beginners against collecting endless ingredients, thinking that's where the secret lies. Thinking if you take this and you take that and you mix everything together, that's alchemy. You're going to make what you are seeking. But he says that the first thing the true alchemist must learn is how to dissolve the true matter. And that immediately made me think of the first stage of the great work, which is Negretto, the blackening. Negretto is dissolution. It is decay. It's the breaking apart of what can no longer remain as it is. Psychologically, I think we've all experienced Negretto. It is the identity crisis, the grief, the depression, the moment where the person you thought you were begins falling apart. It's the ego death, Nobody enjoys that stage, but nature doesn't skip it ever. Nothing transforms without first breaking down. The author then begins describing the union of mercury and sulfur within what he calls our water. And I'll be honest, this is one of those places where I'm still learning what exactly our water means. There are many different interpretations of what the alchemist meant by this water, but I've read this text a lot and I found myself thinking symbolically rather than literally. For me, mercury represents the reflective aspects of ourselves, like our mind, our inner world, our capacity to receive. And sulfur feels more like our essence and our will, the fiery part of us that gives direction and purpose. The author says these must unite in perfect harmony within this special alchemical water. And I couldn't help asking myself, what is that water? The way I currently understand it, and this is very, very much my own interpretation, is that the water represents spirit itself. It's the medium that allows transformation to happen without destroying us. Almost like boiling pasta without the water, the pasta will burn. The water doesn't stop the transformation, it makes the transformation possible. The author also insists that all this happens inside a sealed vessel. Nothing can escape, and the vessel must be heated slowly, very slowly. Again, doesn't that sound exactly like nature? Nothing in nature unfolds overnight. A rose doesn't bloom all at once, it opens one petal at a time. Fruit ripens slowly. Trees take decades to mature. Anything and everything meaningful happens according to its own rhythm. So maybe the sealed vessel is us. Maybe it's the body. Maybe it's a life lived honestly enough that we stop running from ourselves long enough for transformation to actually occur. Because real transformation isn't something that we force, it's something we make space for. And I think that's a lesson the Rosarium is trying to teach from the very beginning. Great work doesn't begin by chasing gold, it begins by learning how to become the kind of vessel capable of holding transformation. Before we end today's episode, I want to leave you with one final thought. The Philosopher's Stone is probably the greatest mystery in all of alchemy. For hundreds of years, people have argued over what it really is. Is it a literal substance, a state of consciousness, or a spiritual realization, or maybe something else entirely? After spending a lot of time studying these texts, I do think I've come to my own understanding of what the Philosopher's Stone is, and I think every single person has access to it. But I'm not going to tell you what I think just yet, because I'm really not trying to be mysterious or anything, and I definitely do not think it's because I'm right. So one of the things I've come to appreciate about the alchemists is that they rarely give people answers outright. They wanted the reader to wrestle with the symbols, and to sit with the questions and to really form their own understanding before hearing someone else's interpretation. And I want to give you that same opportunity. So, as we move through the Rosarium Philosophorum together, I want you to pay attention to the symbols. I really want you to sit with them and let them challenge you. Ask yourself what the stone actually might represent. Because by the time we reach the end of the series, I'll share my own interpretation, and it'll maybe be the same as yours, or maybe it'll be completely different. But either way, I think your own understanding will mean far more if you arrive there yourself first. So until next time, I want you to keep contemplating, keep observing nature, and I want you to ask yourself, if the Philosopher's Stone isn't something to be found, could it be something to be realized?